Corey.
Hi, Carol. This is the question I want to start with. Why feminist veganism now?
Why? Why not? No. How else are we going to get rid of Trump unless we all just disinvest from everything that he could possibly benefit? No. So I changed the subtitle of Sexual Politics of Meat, which used to be Feminist-Vegetarian Critical Theory, and it's now Feminist-Vegan Critical Theory. And I had debated doing that for the 25th anniversary edition. And I thought, well, what's my responsibility to the book and the sort of historicity of the book? And I can't claim that some of the people I talk about were vegetarian, were vegan, they were probably vegetarian. And I kept thinking about it. And then I got an email from somebody who teaches me up in Quebec. And he said, you know, it is a feminist vegan theory. You identify it as a feminist vegan theory. So why don't you just subtitle it that? So I wrote back and said, well, for all these reasons. And he said, yes, but it's still a feminist vegan theory. And I thought, well, yes, I should claim it because vegetarianism is kind of retrograde. It's not enough, especially in terms of a feminist analysis of reproductive exploitation. And if anybody thinks my book is only vegetarian, then my book is going to look more conservative than it is. So I need to catch up with how the word vegetarian has changed in society. Because even in 2000, I had an editor who wouldn't let me put vegan on a title. So, but it's, you know, it's been around for a while. And vegan has moved the signpost. And vegetarian clearly means you haven't dealt with dairy and eggs. So I should. But then I had to reread the whole book last year to find out where I would change. You know, you just can't do search and find. So I had to reread the whole book, and I hope I don't have to do it again. But I mean, there were parts that impressed me. I have to say, oh, did you think that? But that was good. And so then I could mark it up, and we updated it. And that was very exciting because I do think that there is sort of this growing interest in dairy and eggs, both claiming it as this healthy diet. Then you've got these pandemics, and we clearly understand through other feminist scholarship, Catherine Gillespie's Cow with the Ear Tag, and I never remember the number because perhaps I resist. It's a beautiful book. She's a feminist geographer, and she goes to all these sites of the oppression of the dairy cow, and some incredible work by feminist lawyers, feminist law scholars looking at dairy, that the book needed to keep pace with the conversation it was having.
But this is not to say that you hadn't already had language for that, because you were pretty explicit in calling it feminized protein, which encompassed that.
Yeah.
So would you like to explain feminized protein, which is still quite relevant and interesting?
So you all probably, well, just to rehearse, I had the idea in 1974. In 1976, a publisher offered to publish a book, and I wrote it. I interviewed about 50 feminist vegetarians in Boston. It was, you know, this great experience. And I wrote the book, but what was I, 25? I didn't think it was very good. All it said was, well, there's this and then there's this. It was a comparison, and kind of so what? It didn't explain why. So I stopped working on it, withdrew it from the publisher. People said, you know, what if somebody else writes the book? And I said, well, okay, this isn't good enough. I'm going to wait. So then I spent a lot of time as an activist, starting the Hotline for Battered Women and working against racism, which is exactly what the book needed. It needed to be grounded in activism. And then in 1987 or around then, I kind of felt this moment of liberation of what you're trying to do doesn't exist, so you need to make it up. And the two things I did then was sort of liberate the concept of the absent referent from literary criticism, because it seemed so applicable to animals, that animals are absent reference in our consumption of food from them. They disappear as living beings, they disappear conceptually, and then they disappear because they're used as metaphors. And in the 19th century in the United States, vegetarians talked about animalized protein. In other words, we all get protein from plants. Some of us get it directly, some of us get it from animals. And it's interesting because some historians then say, oh, these vegetarians were uptight about the body, animalized protein. No, they were naming it, clearly. And so I thought, well, how do we talk about dairy and eggs? So I made it up. I called it feminized protein. And it's sort of remarkable because that spoke to other people. And especially this one artist who created art around feminized protein that still blows my mind. But that's where feminized protein came from, just this moment of liberation that I needed to make it up. So with those two concepts, I went from comparison to inner connection. And then I could finish the book.
So that leads me to the next point, is when we're talking about it in that way, it becomes a little bit more than gender, doesn't it? Because one of the arguments you've made is that now we can look at colonial politics, racial politics, and how different groups, such as the Irish, people in Africa who've been in Latin America who've been colonized, and one of the justifications for that is that you're eating feminized protein, not proper protein, as the British beef eaters might. Which that is an aspect of your theory, I think, that not a lot of people are aware of.
So in the first chapter, Sexual Politics of Meat, I talk about the racial politics of meat and beef eaters, this whole concept. But during my years of activism, I just kept reading, just pouring it sort of through my brain, like priming a pump. And I came across these writings that were explaining why the British were so successful, colonizing the world, as it were, and that they were beef eaters, and the people they conquered were rice eaters. And so the beef eaters were virile, masculine, and the rice eaters were feminized and feminine. And this still hangs around in the reaction to tofu. Tofu comes from feminized people, and this is one reason I think it's distrusted. But we see this in the 19th century where there were attacks on Chinese people who were immigrants because they were rice eaters, and there were pamphlets against them. The other thing that's interesting is the way, and I talk about this more in Burger, a small little sort of dissenting view on the hamburger, that the cow was used as a tool of colonization. So in the land we know of as North America, the cow comes, and it's not just that colonialists eat the cow and drink the milk, but the cow is used to take over the land of the indigenous people. In New England, cows, acts of resistance, didn't like being in a pasture, and they broke through. But Native Americans didn't use pasture, and didn't use a lot of fencing. Suddenly they have to fence to protect their property. And in the Midwest, the cows are, the erase and replace colonialism. And erase and replace, that's settler colonialism, is erase and replace. And that's exactly what happened with Native American land, Native American people, and throughout the world, the traditional foods of African, Asian, indigenous people.
I was actually rereading some of Manisha Dekka's work on colonization and dairy. I was just wondering, like, since we're on that topic now, yes, cows and dairy production are very much so proxies for colonization. That continues to be the case. So what are your thoughts on this feminized protein, looking at dairy and colonization today?
There is an incredible book by, and I'm sorry, I might not get her name right, because I've emailed with her and blurbed her book, but I've never heard it pronounced. Yamini Namaya, Namayyan. I might have missed
The book is Mother Cow.
That's right. So Mother Cow. It's from Stanford University Press, and she shows what happens in India. Why, where the cow is supposedly sacred, is India now the biggest producer of dairy? And the treatment of cows in India, it's just...
Beyond.
Yeah. So, there's the legacy. We could, the legacy of colonialism. And she just does this brilliant job of looking at that. And we see it, for instance, if you ever are with someone, of course you're not doing it, but if you're ever with someone who goes to a Mexican restaurant and gets beef fajitas with cheese, that would not have existed. There were no cows for the food of people who live in the area we call Mexico to have had anything like that. And so there's a wonderful group, Food Empowerment Project, FEP, their website's Food is Justice, and they have recipes for a variety of cultures, indigenous cultures that, sort of reclaiming the traditional food. So they have a variety of recipes to counter this.
Thanks. So it's like we're going to talk a lot about gender intersections with gender and feminism today, but I wanted to make it clear this is so deeply intersectional, and a lot of your work and in sexual politics meet that as feature. But I think in kind of popular discourses, we forget that that's in there. Can I take it back? As you were mentioning kind of the 1974, when you're kind of starting to think about this, what you skipped over was that this was a paper in Mary Daly's class. And for people who don't know, and I didn't know this until researching for my own book, that you were in her class, a coveted place in her class. This is one of the big second wave feminists. So obviously she would have had an influence over you. And can you talk about what that was like being in her class and this paper, which would become this book?
Yes. So I wanted to become a vegetarian after my pony died. There were some teenagers hunting nearby. It was never clear whether the pony had been shot or died of a heart attack from fright. But he was dead, and that night I went to eat a burger. I was very upset. And I thought, well, I wouldn't eat my pony. Why would I eat this cow? And aren't I a hypocrite for eating someone I did not know? And I think that thought process was able to happen because I'd already been a feminist and doing consciousness raising. So I'd already been sort of working with these ideas of the personalist political. And but the idea of being a vegetarian and becoming a vegetarian are two different things. And at first it was very hard. I lived in an omnivore community. And then when I knew I was moving to Cambridge, I moved in with two other feminists. And oh my God, I wish we had an iPhone back then. You'd go to the Cambridge Women's Center and, there's all the little 3x5 cards. Feminist household looking for vegetarian, or feminist household looking for vegetarian interested in history. Feminist, that's the one I went to. Luckily they picked me, but, with little phone numbers. I remember calling from a phone booth. And because I was in, there's something called the Boston Theological Institute where you could take classes at any of the 7 institutes. So I was taking also a class at Harvard Divinity School on feminist meta-history. It just mind-blowing, not looking at feminist history, but who's deciding what's history? We looked at Eloise and Abelard, for instance, and the completely screwed up way that story is told. So I was immersed and I was in a feminist singing group. I was immersed in feminism at home and at Harvard, and then I wanted to study with Mary Daly. She had done a book in 1973 called Beyond God the Father, and for all of us, it was mind-blowing. Back then, I would buy any of these hardback books that came out because I wanted to read them hot off the presses. And she just, in a short book, dealt with so many important ideas about the power of naming. And it was a very radical way of approaching issues. So taking her course, one of the first things she did, she had just come back from being in France, and she'd met Francois de Beaune, and I don't speak French. Is that how you pronounce D apostrophe E-A-U-B-O-N-N-E. Her book is now available in English, so Housmans, you might want to get it. Feminism or Death. Oh, okay, yay. I should have said, I'm so glad you had it, because it just came out in English 3 or 4 years ago, and it came out in 1974, an early ecofeminist text, and Mary read from it. And she also was reading from Virginia Woolf, Three Guineas, about processions and possessions, and possessions, and professions. All the things that exclude us. So it's a more radical book than A Room of One's Own. And my life was just a life of feminist thought and theory, and I was reading, back to the history, there was a new book, 3 volumes, Notable American Women. And I was reading it cover to cover, and just noting when it said somebody was a Graham Fowler. You'd get such little information. And I really am answering the question. The other thing I did is I went to the Schlesinger Library, one of the premier libraries of collections of women's history. And at that point, they had 3-ring binders. And I looked through every 3-ring binder to see what they had. And there was one, the collection of the papers of Agnes Ryan, and it was simply, doesn't fit in vegetarian novel, put in feminist novel, ? And I thought, here's somebody, whose work I need to read. So all of that sort of exploded into my theory, and I presented it at the feminist meta-history class. There was also something really important, like Housmans, a feminist bookstore, where I'd go and, the women would tell me novels and other things I could read once I had this idea. So Mary was important, but was part of this. Mary created the space, but there was other spaces too. And the interesting thing was, when I submitted my paper to her, her basic comment was, yes, but it's hard to be a vegetarian. So I thought that...
Wasn't she a vegetarian?
Not then, She did become a vegetarian, but not...
Did you have anything to do with that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't. She really was sort of resistant. Yeah, these are all good ideas, but, she said, I still have the paper. It's hard on planes. She was traveling around. She'd been discovered.
It's still hard on planes.
Yeah, but when you're 23 and you're exploring ideas, to have a safe space to do that is the most important thing. And that's what that whole community gave me.
What I think is so fascinating about it is that this comes out of a student paper. And so often I'm not a student anymore, but this is something that I try to impart on my own students, is when I find instances like AFCO.
Right.
Af and Sil Co, who were basically students when they wrote Afroism, which changed vegan feminism thought and the movement. They were young people when they wrote that. So what I was surprised to learn, which I only found out recently through my own research, that you were doing this as a student as well. And I think that's amazing that, okay, snarky comment about it's hard to be vegetarian, But yeah, having that space to do that. Can I ask a more difficult question about Mary Daly now?
Yeah, it's very sad. Transphobia. It's
Pretty blatant. So when I found out about that connection, I deep dove
Right.
into Mary Daly, and there was some really blatant, offensive, anti-trans nonsense. Like, where is this even coming from?
I know.
It was a different time, but also it was pretty extreme. But now, why I bring this up is because now there's more trans-inclusive vegan feminist theory
Right.
that's coming out that is now dragging you into this and saying, well, you're being gender essentialist, da da da. Which you're very clear in the book. I actually highlighted it on the train today. I'm not for gender essentialism. And yet, because we're making claims about gender and species, you have to make some kind of claims about what it means to be a woman that can then be off-putting, I guess. What do you think about this?
so for Mary, that was very sad. And it's a very complicated legacy. Like for the 20th anniversary edition, she had just died. And I thought, well, she was my first reader. I should remember her. And I did put the dedication, and I thought, this is really risky because I don't agree. I don't agree with her. I think there were some complications in her life and maybe her illness, without going into it, that I not to mitigate what she did. I think the best way to think about the work of the sexual politics of meat is that one of the ways the sexual politics of meat is working in our world, you know, the reaction to men who are vegan and, you know, still thinking they're gay or weak, or, you know, all the negative responses, is that veganism by men is challenging the gender binary. The gender binary needs meat eating, and meat eating needs the gender binary. So rather than actually siding with essentialism, I think sexual politics of meat is offering an additional way to understand why there is such resistance to veganism, because it's helping to explode the gender binary. That we're, you know, there are multiple ways of being in this world and having identities, but the sexual politics of meat doesn't want that, and is firmly, you know, based within this gender binary. This is why, too, you know, actually, if you look at the history of the animal rights movement, what we have is men trying to work within the gender binary and be rational and, you know, not base a movement on care or compassion, because that would weaken the movement. Instead of, you know, and even now I'd say to men, help blow up the gender binary. Yeah, I care. And that it takes, you know, all these interviews, and maybe, Kate, you all know whether there was one that reported that men were afraid to be vegan because they were going to be laughed at it, but there was some questionable things about the methodology of that a few years ago, a British study. And it's like, how is eating meat courageous? You are eating these butchered parts of mistreated animals. Why don't we use this as a way to blow up gender by saying compassion is really important, and that's what I'm committed to. You know, you are, I mean, also, I think it's a weakness to feel that you, for men to keep eating meat because they're afraid of their peer group. There's a wonderful book by John Stoltenberg, who was married to Andrea Dworkin, called Refusing to be a Man, and he argued that you could either choose manhood or you could choose justice. So I think in the animal rights movement, all the men, most of the men, not all, many of the men, the white men leading the movement in the 1990s and early 2000s, they chose manhood. So I don't know if that, even like when, I've tried to be very clear on this. We have to have an analysis of gender, because gender is a side of oppression. this whole thing, talking about that there are only 7 women exhibited in the National Gallery. And one of the things we learned today on our tour was when you're shown paintings that don't have names to it, the ascriptions are, if it's a flower painting, it's thought it's by a woman. Gender is a side of oppression. We have to work with it. We have to name it. That doesn't mean we believe in it or want it to continue in the way it does.
So I think that's in a nutshell, what we're dealing with now with sort of third wave, if you will, vegan feminism, is that we now recognize there's so much more to the gender binary. There's a whole diversity. How do we theorize it without invisibilizing some folks or creating this essentialist sort of framework? So there is some interesting vegan trans feminist theory that's coming out that's worth a look. But you mentioned, now because this is my wheelhouse, is when we talk about the politics of the animal rights movement. You mentioned that the animal rights movement has unfortunately sort of bought into that gender script. And most famously, and I can say that in the UK, because of the different culture here, that PETA UK retired the Naked Lady campaign a few years ago, or said they did. Whereas in the US, this has been kind of quintessential to People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals campaigning since the 90s. In fact, what I found in research looking at old Feminists for Animal Rights newsletters is that in the 80s, or in the late 80s and the 90s, FAR was very active in working with PETA, doing conferences together, I think Marty Kiel did presentations for them. And then they launched in the early 90s, I'd rather go naked than wear fur, or all these other things they latched onto that. And then there was this sort of split with the feminists. But that is still sort of become the bread and vegan butter really for PETA over the past 30 years. Why are they doing this?
Well, because Ingrid is a misanthrope. She...
You have to explain that. So many people would say, and she would say, I'm a woman and this is feminism and these women choose and consent to be here.
Well, she does say that, but she'll say anything. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to say. She's a misanthrope. I think she has seen how terrible humans treat animals.
She's probably seen the worst of the worst in her job.
And so, it's not how it impacts humans that matters. It's what matters is getting it discussed. If you can put, like, there was a very controversial thing where, do you all know, I don't know if you ever saw these Got Milk campaigns and people would have the milk. Well, Giuliani, before he became an election denier and all, he got prostate cancer, and so they did one with Giuliani with a mustache, and it said, got prostate cancer. And people were really angry, but they measured the success of that by how many people called PETA and said, you can get prostate cancer from milk. The controversy isn't the point. The response to the controversy is the point. So in terms of the Naked campaign, she and I were both, on the advisory board of Feminists for Animal Rights. So Batja Bauman, who was then the director, arranged for Ingrid and me to have a conversation, and it was being taped. And then it was going to be typed up by somebody at PETA, and we would run it in FAR. So Ingrid just launches, as we start the conversation, just launches into everything. There's nothing wrong with porn, and if men want to have naked women in their garages and, all that. And I was trying to answer what I thought were the concerns, but they forgot to turn over the tape. And so my comments were not recorded. But Ingrid didn't have time to do another conversation, but she said I could say whatever I wanted. And I thought, well, that's not what the idea was. And also at that point, maybe it was 94, I thought, really, do I want Ingrid's really sort of, I thought, anti-woman statements to go public? I was a little protective of her. So that never went public. But it's the same thing. Now, there is one person, Bruce Friedrich, when he was vice president, he did run naked in front of Buckingham Palace
Oh,
once.
okay.
So
same
I mean,
difference then.
but it's anything that can get attention. So, for instance, one year they gave out fur coats to homeless people. I think that one made me the maddest of all because we moved to Dallas for my partner, Bruce. He ran a homeless day shelter. And he felt that there are some people who are homeless because they are so ethical. They can't figure out how to work within the world. They're so ethical. So the idea that homeless people had no ethics, so they could have fur coats.
I think more than that, though, it was to kind of sully fur by associating it with unhoused persons. Yeah.
So what happened is in the mid-90s, they got a new, Kim Stallwood, an activist here in the UK, was their first executive director. But around 93, he left as they were changing, and they brought in someone from fashion. And they realized, how much attention they could get. Now, for the 20th anniversary, I reached out to PETA and I said, through one of the vice presidents, and I said, we disagree about a lot, but we agree about dairy. How about Ingrid and I doing a letter to every director of feminist or women's or gender studies in the United States and sending a copy of the book? Maybe it would be $10,000. I knew that they had sent a copy of Animal Liberation to every congressman. So why don't we say, here's what we agree on, dairy? And they came back and said, no, we don't have $10,000 to do that. But then I was on a panel at Stanford with a woman who had just edited a book on Mark Twain and animals. And she said, I got this letter from PETA, and they were so impressed by the book that they sent $10,000 to this Mark Twain place in Mississippi or Missouri. And she said, it's a place that doesn't deal with race at all, that, is almost racist in some of the ways it deals with Mark Twain. She said, if they had asked me, I would have told them, don't send it to this place. They never consulted her. And I thought, there's our $10,000. So anyway, a little background. Why do they do it? Because it gets news. I met a grassroots activist, and PETA had come through town, blown through, done a naked thing, and
people coming through town,
and they were staging something. Maybe 3 or 4 months later, called the local paper, and they said, "Is anybody going to be naked? We'll come again when someone's going to be naked." So it completely ruined the relationship between the grassroots group. On the other hand, a lot of young women, college women, who have brought me to their campus, that's where they could get employed in the animal rights movement. And one of the questions they told me they were asked was, well, were they willing to be in a cage? Were they willing to go naked? And some are, some from 20 years ago are still working there. They've found it a good place to work. So it's a complex thing. But the idea that they would, more problematic too, or equally problematic, is how they've dealt with slavery and how they've dealt with the Holocaust, which is exactly what was the problem with the first way I wrote my book, comparisons. That was all it was. There's no theory that, Ingrid said to me, "Oh, Carol, you can do theory. I'm busy being an activist." And I thought, this dialectic or dualism, I think theory should inform activism. And the idea that anybody's a pure activist without thinking about this, it's really bankrupt. But that's how she responded to me.
So that leads me to this question then. So here we are on this anniversary. And I remember when I was introduced to this book 20 years ago, sorry to date us both.
I'm dated. How can
Yeah, I'm in my 40s now, but I remember I was in graduate school and someone told me about the book, and I was like, oh, because I was an activist, but I wasn't doing vegan studies. I was doing something different. And this guy told me about the book. I get the book, and obviously it would have made an impact because I'm doing what I do now. So what do you think then? I was reading on the train today from the last anniversary edition and reflecting, I think, on the past 20 years or so. And then there was another preface from the 10 years before and the 15 years before. So now that we're doing this release, what are your reflections now? What's changed? What's held constant?
So what has held constant is that the way Rush Limbaugh, who was, do you all know who he was, this talk show host? He kind of appeared in the late 1980s. And when Sexual Politics of Meat came out, he loved to hate this book. I mean, and at first, that's back when publishers had people who traveled around the country going to bookstore, and so they're listening, and they think, oh my God, all these people are hearing about the Sexual Politics of Meat, it's going to sell books. No. And my editor said they don't read books, but Limbaugh created the script that the right wing is using still. Political correctness has become wokeness. He's the one who harped on that. Instead of being able to call it critical consciousness, which is what we're supposed to do, have critical. So he had his ditto heads, as he called, all over the country subscribe to their college newspaper and clip out things that were offensive and then send them to Limbaugh, who would then talk about them. And one of the things he would talk about was the idea that feminist veganism was an idea. And this young philosophy professor had given a paper on feminist veganism, and it was written up in the school newspaper as they, oh my God, they got torrential mail. And of course he goes on the air and says, now write, if you're an alum, say you're going to withhold the money. The playbook for what's happening now was laid down by Limbaugh. It's the same thing. The difference is that when Jordan Peterson attacked me and sent his followers after me, they used 4-letter words. Limbaugh and his followers still operated before social media. So, that's one of the differences. Social media allows the right, we saw it. What's happened with Twitter and all has allowed the right wing to twist and turn, but it all was there in Limbaugh. So the right wing attack is stronger. This Trump taking 400,000, something from Colombia. Supposedly it's just been released that they're going to look at all the grants, and if it says women, gender, they're not. It really shows how threatening equality is. Really, I mean, I think that what we were seeing was a movement towards increased equality and protection for vulnerable people like LGBTQIA people. We were beginning to protect them, or trying to have protections. And so the height of political correctness and the height of wokeness is when you make a connection between two oppressions. Because wokeness might be about opposing, one form of oppression, but the height of it, the most insulting thing about it, is when you try to make connections. So we're living in a world where, say, feminist veganism is considered even, more outlandish. How can you possibly understand this? It's ridiculous. Who do you think you are? And of course, the responses back then and now exemplify the sexual politics of meat. That's what's so fascinating. The other thing that's changed, veganism, we know the word. There's Mildred's gone vegan. How long has Mildred been vegan? Mildred's been vegan. It used to be just vegetarian. Mildred's has 7 sites in London. There used to just be the one in Soho. Those are all examples. It makes veganism more of a target, and yet it also means that we have more vegan food available, which is important for surviving. We haven't undercut national funding of animal agriculture. Really, if you could, it's not going to happen in the next 4 years, just wipe out the support of animal agriculture in the United States. Nobody would ever say veganism is expensive. In the United States, the price of dairy is promised to be held at a certain thing. So if the price goes too low, the United States government buys it up and dumps it on prisons and elementary schools. So sorry, Corey,
this is relevant.
The NAACP united with a group called the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine and sued the USDA about 20 years ago for the recommendation of dairy as one of the foods that should be eaten every day, because that discriminated against African Americans, because it's white people of Northern European stock who have the enzyme that can digest milk. And it made me think about how we dump the cheese, that for a while there was this whole discussion about how black kids act out in elementary school. And I thought, they're arriving at school and being given a school breakfast with milk. And then given a school lunch. And by about 2 p.m., I'm wondering what's happening in their intestines and their gut from being fed this. And so we're being told this is a problem of black kids. And I thought, I think this is a problem of dairy. To uncover.
And you've written somewhere about how there's this stigma in the United States about the welfare queens, but there's no stigma against the welfare cattle kings who are getting all these subsidies to sustain this unsustainable industry.
Being able to graze their livestock on federal land and not pay it. And subsidies because they're not paying for the damage to the water that's getting the runoff from manure or from slaughterhouses. So of course, welfare queens fit the whole thing, of intersectional oppressions, as Kimberly Crenshaw identified that, and of course, when she talks about that in 1989, is we can better see how oppression is working, So, for instance, street harassment, where I might be called a C, but an African-American woman walking down would be called a black C. And Crenshaw thought that by recognizing intersectional oppressions, we would be able to name it, that street harassment's a problem, and here's an example. But the welfare queen was always black because it's racist and sexist. This is how our culture works. And this Super Bowl, for the first time in 5 or 6 years, had a Carl's Jr. ad with a buxom blonde eating a hamburger. Carl's Jr. is a burger company in the United States, and they're known for showing, really over-the-top, buxom women eating meat and being looked at, John.
Come on, they're rolling around naked on cars.
Women, men look at women and women look at men looking at women. This is the Carl's Jr. thing. And for the first time, it was back at the Super Bowl. It was like Carl's Jr.
I thought they had discontinued it, but they brought it back.
This year, so Carl's Jr. is saying, Trump's back, we're safe.
Yes.
So
everyone needs to make a note after today to go and YouTube Carl's Jr. /Hardee's, because I'm from East Coast, it's Hardee's. It is so abominable that when I teach this to my students, I play it just let's randomly pick one off of YouTube because they're all so horrendous.
I mean, the other thing that happened, one of the things that changed, the original Sexual Politics of Meat only had 2 images that sort of illustrated it. The cover image, the woman, and that only came about because the people who traveled around selling books said, we're never going to be able to explain what this book is about. We need an image on the cover. That's how that came about. And inside the Ursula ham dress, which I first saw thanks to a British animal rights publication called The Beast, the magazine that bites back. It was from the 1980s. I found it here when I was here in 1980 and subscribed. And Jim Mason, an animal activist in the United States, sent it to them. But those were the only 2 images. But within 2 weeks, people started sending me images.
Let's talk about that, because this is one of the cool things about this lifelong project that Sexual Politics of Meat has become. It's been collaborative, and each edition that comes out, there's more. There's one from Canterbury that Christoph Daunt sent you.
Yeah.
That I walked by a million times and should have, because it was on the street that I live on. But can you talk about what it's been like over the years to collect from different people all over the world? Because you do talk about that in the previous edition, what it's like that, not just that people are sending you pictures, but sending you stories as well.
I did not know this was going to be a lifelong project. And after working on the book for 15 years and it was finally done, I remember there were a couple days where I thought, well, now what will I do? And the response was so incredible. And, you know, when you've been a writer for that long, you don't know what it's going to be like to be an author. And nothing could have charted it anyway. I mean, I would open these packages. Ingrid actually sent me the turkey hooker, which was this thing for Thanksgiving. But Ingrid was sent it, and she forwarded it to me back in the cordial days. You know, I've been sent hot sauce and beer bottles and T-shirts, all illustrating this idea, which I didn't have that soundbite, but the animalization of women and the sexualization and feminization of animals. And when I'd get an image, sometimes I'd look at it and think, ew. And then I'd think, oh, because here was a further illustration, or here's something I need to understand. Why? Why is this recurring? What's going on? And I had little kids at the time. I remember when I got the turkey hooker, and it's this actual hook for removing a carcass, a corpse from the oven. But the turkey has all those conventional tropes of a sexualized female. And this is what's so interesting is people say animal rights, that we're anthropomorphizing animals. And the people who anthropomorphize animals are the ones who are eating them. They want to believe that animals want to be consumed. And it's not enough to think that. What is consumption? What is willing consumption? And they use these sexualized images. So anyway, the turkey hooker arrives, and my 8-year-old son comes in and says, what's a turkey hooker? And, you know, at that point, we had already had to explain, because we had been picketed by anti-abortion activists who were actually targeting my husband. But I thought, I just don't know how to explain this to him. We've explained abortion, and we've explained bullies, and, you know, I'm not ready. But then my other one, when he was 10 or 11, or maybe 12, I hope he was 12. Somebody came to me and he said, you're not going to be able to show your slideshow on campus, because all I was using was carousel slides. You know, the worst machines in the world is all that's going to exist. And he stayed up all night, a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, and digitized all my slides. Mm. And I didn't even have his name when I handed over the slides. And it was the next morning, and I had to catch a plane, and I thought, what have I done? I don't even know his name. But he bicycled in, having pulled an all-nighter. And when I got home with the digitized images, I didn't know what to do, but my 12 or 13-year-old, whatever age he was, he worked with them. And then when he was 15, he was with me when I was at Harvard. I said, I don't know if I want you to watch this. He said, I've handled them all. So it's very depressing. One does not set out to be a sort of cartographer of misogyny and animal abuse. And it's very painful. And, but I just believe in justice. And people trust me. You know, people would say, who have to read animal agriculture magazines, that send me these, that rip out the ads and say, I'm so glad I have someone I can send to who gets this. I thought, yes, I'll carry your burden with you, but this is painful material. And yet we need to know about it. So just to finish on that, back in 2010, I showed the slideshow at Harvard, and I had just come from caregiving for my father, who had been very ill. I was very tired, and somebody asked me about how many images are there like this out there, you know? And I said, well, I don't give a damn about statistics. The fact that there's even one is what matters, and there are so many more than one. But this is the umbrella of misogyny under which we are operating. And I think it's better to make it visible to us and for us to know what's out there and see it and name it for what it is. It isn't a joke. You know, there was some chain in London with a chicken, a sexualized chicken, I don't remember what it was called, that people were sending me over and over again. People are walking by. It's acculturating people to accept oppression as funny, and that women's images can be used this way. I mean, it's not just that it's disturbing, it's that it is laying down the basic principles of oppressive attitudes that are operating in a culture.
Another thing that you say often is that this is a presumed male public as well. This public space is marked as male, and that's one of the ways.
One of the earliest things I was sent was a menu from just a regular restaurant in Chicago, double D-cup breast of turkey sandwich. On the menu, this sandwich is so big. And it encourages sexual harassment. Imagine sitting at a table, you're handed this, you're in a mixed group. Of course, it gives permission to talk about bodies with big breasts and participate in that. So it gives permission. It doesn't just perpetuate, it creates the climate.
What is it about animality that has become so pivotal to this project of misogyny? What is your theory on that?
Oh, I think I should have had somebody else ask me questions. These are too... No, I'm sorry, Corey. This is great. You're get right to the point. I think the basic issue is human exceptionalism was always white male exceptionalism. That the way human was defined in Enlightenment Europe was as a white male property-owning individual. That was human, because that's who could vote. That the basic rights of a human weren't for everybody. So then we've got this contestation. Well, I'm human too. You know, there's a button, feminism is the radical notion that women are human. Okay, but what if I don't like the notion of human? What if human is the problem? How we've defined human. And so we see us trying to race up the human hierarchy. Don't put us down by animals. And we have people of color trying to get up the human hierarchy. You know, don't treat us as animals. And LGBT cute people saying, don't treat us as animals. Well, maybe the problem is the definition of human. That the human as an exclusive, rational, bipedal, autonomous individual. I mean, we know from disability studies how autonomy is defined is wrong. Autonomy isn't the ability to do everything. It's the autonomy is within the self to know what one needs. One might not be able to meet those needs, but that we live in a world of connection. So, the other issue there was that the rational was the human, and care and compassion was more animal-like or emotional, or becomes equated with femaleness. So that the concept that we're all autonomous beings was always a lie. We learn how to walk if we can walk, and talk if we can talk, through others. And one philosopher's called that second person knowledge. We don't exist except in community. And then we have this notion that people made it on their own, this autonomy and human. And so there's also a notion of scarcity, that not everybody can share in the world that was created by that kind of human. And you know what? That might be right, but maybe we don't want to share that kind of world. I mean, maybe the world we want is different, is more communal. So animalizing women, disabled people, people of color, the animalizing function is one of disempowerment and separation, and protects those in power from having to feel empathy towards those they're hurting. So, for a while I was looking at animalizing tropes, like putting women on all fours, images that put women on all fours, or images, and I just send you to the new edition of The Pornography of Meat, which really does try to deal with, this isn't gender essentialism, this is about the gender binary, and this is, not criticizing prostitution, but looking at why is prostitution used as a, imposed on animals and all. But, that men are showed vertical and women are showed horizontal. And so I juxtaposed this ad that showed a woman lying down and a man standing there. And then the next was an ad for eating dead chickens or eating, dead cows or something. And they're in the same position as the woman in the other ad, but the man is removed, because generally to show a man looking at and sometimes you have men looking at sexualized animals, but that might tend more closely that people think you're talking about bestiality rather than eating the animals. So often the man's removed from that. But these are all things that I had to start thinking about because people started sending me images. And I've tried to save the letters, too, that have come with these, so that there's a record. Because and I've saved vegan and vegetarian menus for years, too, because there's a part of me that's worried that all this progress, it's going to be like the suffrage movement, and we're going to lose it. I mean, without even talking about Trump, I've always been worried. So I've always thought, I want an archive that shows what we could eat in 1980, or, what people were writing me in 1990 or whatever. Just create.
What are your plans to do with it?
Well, I was in talks. I've been in talks with a really wonderful archive that I can't name, that I'm very worried about because of Trump, who are very interested. And it would be a great place. And I might just have to wait 4 years.
Hopefully.
So I've been insuring the archive. till it gets settled.
So I have to ask this perhaps last, where are we? Do we have time?
Do we have time, Al? And Kate? One more. Sorry, we could carry
We could
it
go
away.
on and on, couldn't we? But you were talking about the pornography of meat, which I love because that is very student-friendly because pictures.
Yeah.
Pictures say everything. But you were talking about sex work, prostitution, what symbolism that has. But then that immediately triggered me thinking about the very famous essay, also part of a book project, The Feminist Trafficking of Meat, where you take on the feminists and you specifically use that word trafficking because you know what it means and what it symbolically entails. Do you want to maybe finish by discussing, like, what does this conversation have to say to the feminist movement today?
Okay. I actually took that from Emma Goldman. That's where that title came from. I remember back in the mid-1980s how angry I was that feminists weren't seeing these connections and seeing the issue of eating animals. And I was on the Governor's Commission on Domestic Violence in New York, the earlier Cuomo, and would go to dinner, and they're all eating, meat, and I'd say, we're talking about violence, and there was one other a vegetarian from New York, and I'd go home, I'd be so angry, and the only thing that saved me from just being consumed by that was thinking, I started laughing, and I thought, Carol, if they saw it, you'd have nothing to write about. You wouldn't have anything to write about. I think it has been a real struggle. At first, the book, people were saying, feminists were saying, I don't want to read it because I might have to become a vegetarian. And I thought, isn't that what feminist theory is about? Changing, And then people, then there was this time when they responded and said, yeah, we've got to we got to reach humans first. And once we've done that, and that dualism, as though they're in competition with each other. And, one of the things I've always pointed out is I could work against battered women and be a vegetarian, a vegan. It doesn't take any more work to be an activist and a vegan. So, there's generations of arguments there. I think it's very sad that veganism is privatized, but feminism is sort of collective. And I think there are some vegans who have not helped us at all. So just to end, back in 2016, at the end of the year, Ginny Messina, a wonderful vegan nutritionist, and I proposed a book called The Anti-Trump Diet. And we were going to show progressives that if you want to deal, you're concerned about race, you're concerned about the democracy, you're concerned about feminism, you're concerned about immigration and compassion and, become a vegan, and here's the way to do it. And in January of 2017, around the inauguration, our agent sent it out, and many publishers said, he's not going to be around for long. And I've always joked and said, it's the only book of mine that's been rejected based on optimism. And it exists as the protest kitchen. And November 12th, I wrote our agent and I said, would you please see if our publisher would let us change the title? I think it killed the book. It's a great book. It takes you step by step. You want to learn, here's dairy. Here's what you know about dairy. Here's how you try different milks. Here's some recipes. Here's some food you could eat for the anxiety and exhaustion you're feeling. So to me, it's sort of sad because I don't know whether we should, try to reclaim it. So that was my way of trying to speak to everybody, progressives, about where we find ourselves. And I think it's still relevant. Certainly, we are going to be spending a lot of time in resistance. So let's eat well while we do.
Hear, hear.
Um,